All right. I think we've hit critical mass. Might as well jump in here. Like I said, very happy to have all of you with us today. Esther, Diana, and I are thrilled to be discussing what's new in the second edition of this book, Agile Retrospectives. And we're excited to engage with all of you around what questions you might have around the book or about retrospectives more broadly. So thought we'd just start with brief introductions from the three of us. Diana, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Diana Larsen. I was one of the co-authors of the first edition, Agile Retrospectives book, and I'm so excited about this. And, subsequently, I've made a few other contributions to the Agile community, and I'm just happy to see so many people here.
Okay, Esther?
Well, I am the other co-author of the first edition. I'm happy that we added David for the third. Yeah, I've been around the Agile community for a long time. I'm known for my work in retrospectives and organizational change, complexity, and leadership. And I am under the weather today. I came back from the Agile conference with a magnificent cough. I feel like hell. And so I may at some point start coughing, in which case I will go on mute and David will pick up for me.
Great. Well, we're glad, Esther, that you can make it here as much as you can, and we'll fill in for the rest. So I'm David Horowitz. I'm really excited to be here with all of you and just so appreciative to both Esther and Diana for inviting me to be the third co-author on the second edition of the book. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a little company called Retrium. If you haven't heard of us, or even if you had, we make software to help you run more effective retrospectives, especially if you have a distributed or remote team, which we'll get into a little bit more on this webinar. All right, a couple of other housekeeping notes before we jump in. So first of all, as you may be aware from the Zoom interface, we are recording the webinar. I just want to make sure that everyone here knows that. And then I want to talk just very briefly about the agenda, so you know what to expect on the webinar. So the first thing that we're going to do is just a quick question to get a sense of how familiar people are around the first edition of the book, which helps us make sure we're speaking to all of you with the content that is most relevant to you. So that's going to be a very brief question in a moment. And then there's really three sections of the webinar. The first one is what hasn't changed about the second edition as compared to the first. And sneak peek, it has a lot to do with the fundamentals of a retrospective. The second section of the webinar is going to be, well, what has changed? And we're going to give a brief overview of the different aspects of the book that we've either added depth to or brand new sections of the second edition that just weren't there in the first one. And then the third section of the webinar, we're going to dive deep into one of those new parts of the book. And that is around catalyzing and sustaining change after the retro is over as a result of, a little sneak peek again, there's more you can come up with in a retrospective beyond action items. So we're going to talk a bit about that. And then we'll open it up for Q&A at the very end and reserve significant amount of time, hopefully, for the Q&A so that we can have fun talking with all of you and answering all of your questions. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's shift into the poll that I asked about, which is how familiar are you with the first edition of the book? And Esther, I believe you're going to be launching the poll.
I'm going to try.
Okay. All right. So we really appreciate this is very useful information for us. And it looks like half of you are not familiar with the first edition, which is wonderful. We're so graciously appreciative of the fact that we're reaching some new folks here. And that is very exciting to us. So with that as information, let me shift to what hasn't changed from the first to the second edition, and we'll add a little bit of detail there, Diana.
Get rid of that. Yeah, so the fundamentals haven't changed. And in the new book, we have a first section that is now called Nuts and Bolts. And it is many of the things that those of you who are familiar with the book will remember. How do you help your team inspect and adapt? How do you design a retrospective custom fit to your team? How do you facilitate retrospectives if you're inexperienced at meeting facilitation? In the beginning, we really tried to make that easier for folks. And And we've continued to do that. However, these chapters that were in the first book that are now in the second edition, we looked at every word in them. So we have re-examined them. We have said, is that still true? Or do we need to put in, do we need to emphasize that more? Or those kinds of things. So, so even if you're familiar with the first edition, you might want to take a spin through these chapters. We have a whole chapter, we've broken out a whole chapter now. It was included in the facilitation chapter before, but now we have a whole chapter on managing group dynamics. We've gone into much more depth around that. So those will seem familiar to a lot of you. It is all based on the retrospective steps, the frame, what we call the retrospective frame, how to do this, and the fact that a retrospective is a part of the work and it just flows into the work you do in the rest of the iteration. We start with setting the stage, which means getting people ready, getting their heads in the space where we're doing the retrospective, helping them prepare themselves, letting them know what the agenda is, those kinds of things. Then we spend some time gathering data. And what I always emphasize when I talk to people about this is that the retrospective framework is very intentionally built to follow how human brains work individually, sometimes in split seconds, but to do that as a whole group. So we notice we notice something in our environment, and that sets the stage. Then we begin to look at it more closely. Well, what's going on with that thing? We gather data in our own brains. Then we generate insights. Well, why is that meaningful to me? What are the implications of that? What are my options for addressing whatever this thing is? And then we decide what we're going to do about it. And we move into no longer assessing, but closing the retrospective here by beginning to take the action that we've decided to take. So we stumble over a bump in the sidewalk. Wow, I never noticed that that bump before. What's going on with that? Oh, how could I have avoided that? What else could have happened? How am I going to deal with this? Am I going to take a different route? Am I going to always go to the other side of the sidewalk? And then I take that action and I close the retrospective. And so we do that for the Agile retrospectives as a team. And that takes a little longer than the split second that we do that in our own heads. And so that's why we have introduced this retrospective framework. And the other thing that's the same in the book is we still have the chapters on selecting activities for each of these, some activities for setting the stage, activities for gathering data, and so forth. But there is an additional piece here, and we'll introduce you to that in a little bit later, but it has to do with some tips and hints about how to put all of these activities together. And then the third part of the book is largely new and really looks at some very different kinds of things. And so we'll be introducing that to you next. So, Esther?
Yeah, okay. I've been trying to figure out how to do the caption things and I'm not succeeding. So, excuse me. We thought this was going to be just, kind of a nice refresh. And in the end, we added 120 pages of new content. So I think that, there are obviously things in the world that have changed, and there are things that we have learned that made it necessary to update things or made us want to update things. And as we started looking at it, we thought of more and more things than we wanted to add. So there is a chapter that's dedicated to remote, hybrid, and asynchronous retrospectives. Back when we wrote the original book, it was sort of the mantra that, you do things face to face. And so we didn't really cover much in the first edition about how to do remote retrospectives, but the world has changed, and the technology has changed. And so we have all discovered how to be reasonably effective in remote meetings. Hybrid meetings present some different challenges, but we have some ideas in there about how you can overcome them. And we know of some companies that are doing asynchronous retrospectives. So they just open a channel in their Slack or whatever they're using for that kind of communication and let people respond when it's convenient for them. And they still have a facilitator, kind of, shaping the conversation and moving things along, but it's all happening in text. So good stuff on that we hope is helpful to people. I think this has already been alluded to, that in the first edition, we emphasized the importance of having an action come out of the retrospective. And we've realized that sometimes an action isn't what you need to do. Sometimes you need to, rather than go off on a path, you need to do some experiments to figure out what is the right direction to go in, to learn some more about the problem space and the solution space. Sometimes you need to have a learning goal, right? You realize that, we can't take action other than learning about this thing, and then we'll be able to formulate a better decision about how to move forward. Sometimes if you can't find anything that's within your control in the retrospective, the right thing to do is try to influence someone who can control the situation. So it might be an influence plan. And David's going to talk about all of that a bit more. We added a significant section on how to make change stick. One of the things I'm looking to see if it's here in my stack. One of the things that I'd done lately was I wrote a book on organizational change. So we incorporated some of the ideas from that. Because that's something that we have seen teams struggle with. How do you actually implement a change? Because very often the underlying pattern is reinforced in many ways, and you have to kind of look at that in order to get something to change. So how to make changes stick. We also recognize that while many teams are having excellent retrospectives, some are not. And so people may be a little jaded about retrospectives. So we have some guidance on how to entice people to give retrospectives another try. We added depth to the theory behind the 5 steps, because they exist the way they exist for a particular reason. And it's about helping teams think clearly together. So we've gone into more depth about the reasons behind the steps. And I am thrilled to report that we actually found research that supported the statement we've been making for many years, that if people are allowed to remain silent at the beginning, they have tacit permission to be silent for the rest of the retrospective. That was so thrilling to finally find that research. I had observed that phenomena for many, many years, but somebody did formal research on it. That was fun. We went into a lot more depth about using data for retrospectives. I think we talked about data in the first edition, but most of the activities were on subjective data. And so we spent a lot more time looking at how do you bring in objective data, facts versus opinions and perceptions. So much more about the difference between subjective and objective data, when each is appropriate, when you might want to have them both, and lots of examples of what we mean by those terms and how you might present data. So I personally am really happy about including that. And we also went into a lot more depth about how to make decisions, well beyond dot voting. I mean, in some cases you need to express a preference, which is when you would use dot voting, but sometimes you need to evaluate an option. So we have much more information on that. And when we wrote the book originally in 2006, not a lot of people were doing retrospectives at all, let alone Agile retrospectives. So there was a small group of people who were quite familiar with it. And that has really changed. Now there are people all over the world who are really doing wonderful things and inventing new ways to address the phases and solving interesting problems. And we were able to incorporate many of those stories into the book. So you will find lots of some real life stories from people who are out there working with teams, doing retrospectives on a regular basis. So did I miss anything, David?
Yeah, there's one thing that we realized just before the webinar was about to start that we missed on the list. And it's a really important one. I'm really excited about this chapter. It's a chapter that has a certain number of flows to retrospectives or plans for retrospectives based on common scenarios that teams tend to face. You know, it's one thing to have various activities for each of the phases, but it's another thing to link them together in a logical way such that the conversation flows, the data flows, and you end up with some learning or action or experiment at the end that makes sense and resonates with the team. And what we've noticed over the years is that there's certain scenarios teams tend to face that are common across teams and organizations. For example, outages occur, right? What type of retrospective might we choose if an outage occurred? Or new teams form. Maybe what's the first type of retrospective you might run if you're on a new team? Maybe the time to deliver features is increasing. So you've pulled that data in and you realize that we need to focus on this. What type of activities would we string together as a result of experiencing that scenario together? And so we have a whole chapter with 10 of these scenarios and example retrospective flows that target those scenarios. What makes me really excited about this, actually, maybe surprisingly, it's not the specific activities. They're great and you're free to use them, but we put a lot of effort into explaining the rationale or the why behind why we picked each activity. And we're hoping that might inspire you to design your own flows for your retrospectives. So I'm really excited about that chapter.
So I want to say one more thing about that. But I'm trying to type an answer at the same time. So hold on, I'll answer that question. So one of the reasons we didn't give examples in the first edition is that we didn't want people to copy. We wanted people to actually think about what would be the right retrospective for a particular team at a particular time in a particular place. And we wanted people to be very intentional about designing retrospectives. What we observed was that some people, not everybody obviously, but some people would just kind of go through and like, I'm going to pick one from option A and one from option B and one from option C. And like David said, they didn't hang together. They didn't create a coherent flow or help the team really think. They were just, oh, this fun exercise, that fun exercise, that. So that's why we thought it was so important to include the flows.
Anything else new that we wanted to add, Diana or Esther? Mention?
Well, the cover is new. We actually have the retrospective framework Infinity on the cover now. So it's more closely associated with it. I still think this serves as a wonderful compass for helping your team set and follow the direction they want to go in. But we've let go of the compass and added that. And I think, just the fact that we, again, looked at everything we had written in the first edition and examined, is this enough? Does it need to change? What more needs to be here? So I think you'll find if you're very, very, some of you are, how many of you? It's like about 30% of you say that you are very familiar with the original book. I think you'll still find some things in those first chapters that are new and I just see Janelle's question. We've got a lot about psychological safety and the reason why, how a particular activity will help you build psychological safety, why we need psychological safety, why retrospectives help us build psychological safety. There's a lot of that all throughout the book. It's not one specific chapter on it, but it's everywhere.
And there's actually one of the example retrospective flows is in response to a team suffering from low psychological safety.
Yeah.
So we specifically give an example around that scenario, which is sadly far too common in our experience.
And when you don't have safety, that's the first job, is to create some safety.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is why set the stage is there, and close the retrospective. Both of those parts of the framework actually are opportunities to really emphasize the need for psychological safety and or foster it.
Okay, so we wanted to spend some time going into depth around one of the new chapters in the book, and the one that we picked is the second one here on your screen right now, which is all of the alternatives to action items at the end of a retrospective. And this is a chapter from the third part of the book called Catalyzing and Sustaining Change. And turns out that we identified 5 different potential outcomes to a retrospective. So I'm going to switch slides here. The first one is the action item. That hasn't changed. I think if you ask most folks, a successful retrospective is one that ends with at least one fill in the blank, they would likely say the words action item. And while it's true that a successful retro may end with at least one action item, it's not the case that it must end with at least one action item. So action items are really useful in particular when the impediment is under your control, something that you believe you can fix, and your confidence around that is fairly high, that this is the course that we need to take to fix this problem. There is a shared mental model on the team with a high degree of confidence that this is the right thing to do. And many of you are likely familiar with the acronym SMART, which is a fairly effective way, or it can be at least, to write down an action item. It stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And in the book, we give examples of action items that are written more in alignment with the SMART mnemonic and those that may not be. So those are action items. However, if a team is experiencing a situation in which their confidence about the direction that they want to head is lower, then action items are not the best fit. Experiments are. And an experiment is distinct from an action in that, unlike an action which can take a week or two, maybe for the rest of your iteration, ideally experiments are very short and quick, tiny little interventions to just poke the system a little bit to get a better sense of what is the right direction to take. The idea with an experiment is not that this will fix the problem, but rather that we're going to run this experiment to learn more about the right course of action. And so we came up with a mnemonic, or I should be more precise. Esther came up with a mnemonic in her in another book called FINE, which I think is analogous to SMART, but for experiments. And it stands for fast feedback, inexpensive, no permission needed, and easy. And that really helps teams better understand the type of thing we're after here with experiments. I think it's really important to point out with experiments that if the team doesn't coalesce around some particular action, and there might be disagreement or even heated exchanges in the retro about the right course of action, experiments can help lower the temperature a little bit by saying, well, let's just acknowledge that none of us actually know the right course of action in this complex environment that we find ourselves. So let's just try something very small. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, we'll adjust course. Lower the ego involved with the course of action and then just pick something and see how that probe does in the system. So those are experiments. We go into a lot of detail about that in the book. The third type of outcome for a retrospective is influencing others. So sometimes the right course of action is not something that you can control inside your team. You need others from other teams in the organization, or management, or executives even. Or perhaps you are blocked on your team because your team is dependent on some release from another team. There's lots of reasons and situations in which influencing others can help your ability to be more effective at your job. And so in these situations, in the retrospective, it can be really helpful to identify who are we going to talk to, who on our team is going to do the talking, and to spend some time getting into the mindset of the person you'll be talking with. So what are their motivations? Right? What are they concerned about on a day-to-day basis? What metrics are they judged for in their jobs? Because a lot of times, if you try to convince someone or move the system a bit through arguing about what matters to you, that's actually not what needs to be said. You need to get into the mindset of the person you're talking with. So we give specific strategies, one of which is a role empathy map, for example, on how to accomplish that. Okay, so that's influencing others. Then other times, if nothing else works, if we've tried actions and we've tried experiments, we've tried influencing others, and the system is just the system, or it's in the soup, as we like to say, in the circles and soup activity, if you're familiar with it. It's just things about the way this company or this market or this system just happens to work like this. You always, every single time, have at least one thing you can do, which is change your own response to this external stimulus. And to get more precise there, because that sounds nice, but what really do we mean by changing our response? Now, a couple of things that you can do. So one is, and for those of you who are very logical, statistical, mathematical brains, and I count myself in that camp most of the time, this might sound a little out there, but I've tried it, and I can tell you, at least through personal experience, but also with science and data and research to back me up, that this works. Breathing techniques are a phenomenal way to change your blood chemistry. And it can be your team's blood chemistry if you do it collectively with your team, to just change your emotional stance to whatever the situation might be. So, box breathing is a great example of this, where you breathe in for 4 seconds, you hold for 4 seconds, and then you breathe out for 4 seconds. And if you do this with your team, all of you breathing together, you'd be surprised at the movement that can happen, your ability to perceive the same situation in a very different light. And that will open you up to wonder questions, where you can ask yourself, and your team can ask itself, questions like, I wonder whether the opposite of what I'm believing right now might be just as true as what I'm currently thinking. That's something that's very hard for your brain to understand when you're in that kind of reactive mode, a triggered mode. But after breathing through it, you can kind of relax your nervous system and get yourself into more of a wonder state. Another example of a wonder question is, I wonder how this situation, exactly as it is, might be for my benefit. Change your response, right? Start to see the same situation in a new light. So we go into some detail about strategies and how you might do that. Again, you always can control your response, even if you can't change anything else. And then the last thing that we added here, last outcome for a retrospective, is learning or aha moments. And this is sometimes the best retrospectives that I've been in, and I believe Esther and Diana, both of you as well, haven't resulted in any specific thing that we're changing right now in the moment, but rather just a realization that I discovered something, my team discovered something new we weren't aware of before. And that can be enough. There's no rule that says you have to change something, you have to act. Sometimes just learning and letting that sit for a bit can be plenty for the retrospective to be a transformative experience. And sometimes the change will happen more organically after you let that realization just sit in with your team for the next 2 weeks, month, 2 months, whatever it is. Without a doubt, when you learn something, you increase your understanding of yourself, you increase your understanding of your team, the system that you're in, the market, the organization. And again, that increased learning can be plenty for your team to call the retrospective a success. So this is an overview of this one chapter, and you can get a sense of, we added many chapters that are brand new to the book. This is just one of them, and there's so much depth in each one. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all of the depth of every single chapter right now, but we wanted to give you a flavor of the type of content that we've added. Esther, Diana, did I miss anything?
Not in this, but I thought of another thing that should be on our list that we left off of our list. And and I can't remember which chapter it's in, so maybe one of you will be able to remind me. But we talked about the original book was really about, at the end of a sprint, at the end of an iteration, what can we learn from that period of time together? And that was great, and that's still true. But now we are aware of the many opportunities for holding retrospectives, from very, very short retrospectives that may be 15 minutes long that still go through the framework, And very long retrospectives, like, you know, something at the end of a release or at the end of a version, or when you're sunsetting a product or something like that, that you can hold retrospectives in many different ways with different groups in your organization for many different periods of looking at very, very different chunks of time, work chunks. And I think that's something new. I've been actually talking a lot about the very, very short ones when I'm presenting at conferences and things. But there's also, you know, this other end of the very large ones where that include a lot more people and so on. And how do you manage that? You still use the framework, but the context, as the context changes and the participation size changes, there are ways of approaching that as well. And we did include information about that. Do you remember what, if is that in a specific chapter, or is it spread across a few? I don't remember for sure.
It's included in a variety of chapters. It's not its
Yeah.
own chapter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of woven throughout.
Right.
Okay.
And in terms of these outcomes, I have to say one of my favorites is the final two, the change our response and learning, recognizing that, you know, the opportunities for learning in a retrospective are so many, and our work is turning into learning work. We can't always rely on stuff we knew before or old best practices from somewhere else, or which was kind of the hallmark of what we used to call knowledge work. Now things are coming at us so fast, technologies are changing, marketplaces are changing, what we need to know to build, what we need to know about our customers is changing. And so our work has become much more learning work. And what I like about these 5 potential outcomes is it's showing us all the different ways that we can learn as a team, and as a group of people, and that can be valuable for us, and that then become ours and we can move forward with. So I'm really glad you picked this one to zero in on, David. I think it's particularly helpful, as all of them are, of course.
Okay, so we're going to move now to open it up for Q&A, and let you all direct where this conversation is going to go next.
I've been trying to answer questions as we went, so some of them, if you want a longer answer, well, let me just pick out a couple of them.
Esther, while you're looking through, I thought I just mentioned on the slide right now, there's 2 things, 2 calls to action. One is there's a QR code. If you haven't purchased the book and you're interested, that will take you to Amazon, though you can find it at other book retailers also. And on the right is a suggestion, which is if you think that your team or the teams that you work with at your company might be interested in a book club around this, strongly encourage that. This is a great opportunity for you all to learn. And the 3 of us might be interested in showing up and helping you along your learning journey, or maybe at least one of the 3 of us. It can be hard to get us all on the schedule at the same time, but you know, don't be shy about pinging us on LinkedIn or however you want to get in touch, and just reaching out. We might be happy to show up with you, and if our schedules permit, and help you along your learning journey.
So here's a question that we might want to spend a little more time on, from Fortune Book Cults, who says, how do we combat the dreaded Miro Star Wars retro, or even worse, the Tinder retro? Is a half an hour of that better than nothing at all? I find new Scrum Masters lean on these, leaving the teams disillusioned and bored in a very short time. What's your experience? And I gave her a short answer, but I wonder if we want to dwell on that for a little bit more, since I suspect we've all observed that.
So what was the short answer you gave her? We don't have visibility.
But the short answer is cry. I've seen the same thing. I talked to some Scrum trainers who emphasize retro and refer students to sources for further reading. but it is disheartening.
Yeah, I think there's another piece to that, and that is some teams love those fun-packed retrospectives that are on Miro that use themes and those kinds of things. Other teams find them extraordinarily annoying.
Condescending even.
And condescending
Yeah.
and trivializing the very real issues that they may be dealing with. So, my suggestion is, make sure you're taking the pulse of your whole team. Is that something that is appealing, or do you feel like you're getting real outcomes like David was just talking about? Are you getting some improvement actions? Are you doing some influencing? Or is it a moment of fun during your sprint? And that can be team building, but it's not continuous improvement. So, examine the outcomes that you're getting from using a retrospective like that. Make sure that there is a piece of it that sets the stage and that gathers some data and that generates some insights. I mean, that's part of the danger of them, is that it's just fun, and the person who's created it may not have really followed that group thinking process that brings you to a conclusion that you can all buy into, they've already bought into and are ready to move forward with.
And
Yeah, go ahead, Esther.
I just want to point out that a group thinking process is not the same as group think.
Right.
Groupthink is everybody kind of is thinking the same thing, and they're not challenging their assumptions or bringing in different points of view. And I think when we talk about a group thinking process, we mean the opposite of that.
Right. A group of people thinking and analyzing together. Yes. David.
Here's one specific suggestion to build off, Diana, what you were mentioning, which is this is a great opportunity if you are finding a Star Wars themed retro to be boring and have little to no utility. Introduce, after the end of your next Star Wars retro, to close the retro, the ROTI technique, or return on time invested. Ask your team from 1 to 5, how useful was this for you? And, you might be surprised. Maybe everybody else thinks it's a 5, in which case you learned something. That's really interesting information. Or you might discover that everyone rates it a 1, in which case I think what will happen is the team will coalesce around adjusting course on the next retrospective because of their own data that they're sharing with the team. So this is a great opportunity to introduce the idea of inspecting and adapting, not just for the code that you're writing and the product you're producing, but for the retros that you're running as well.
So just for those who aren't familiar with ROTI, it stands for return on time invested. So if you're saying it's a 1, you're saying, this is an hour I'm not getting back, right? Versus a 5, where it's like, this is a really valuable use of my time. I think that's a great insight, David. So here's another question from Valerie Clark, who says, I love retros and facilitating them. I have many activities in my toolbox, but very few that can be done in less than an hour following the framework start to finish. Any suggestions for how to get valuable insights when we don't have a full hour? I have lots of ideas about that personally.
Go for it, Esther.
Well, I mean, I think that and maybe we, somehow sent people down this path, but you don't have to have an activity for everything, right? Sometimes having a really well-crafted question is enough to get people talking in a useful way, right? So that question can be about data. It can be about what kind of insights are you seeing. It can be about what possibilities do you see for moving forward. So when I have a tight frame, I often don't use activities. I use, even though I don't love this term, powerful questions. I use well-chosen questions that will help the team think more deeply. So I'm curious what else you would offer.
I was going to say something very similar, but maybe I'll give a concrete example to that, just to build off what you shared, Esther. So, 5 phases. So the first one is set the stage. So just ask everyone, hey, one word check-in, how are we feeling right now? That will take you 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and it gives you a sense of the room, right? You move on to gather data, and maybe in advance you've realized that, hey, if I bring the cumulative flow diagram today, or the average cycle time plot diagram, or our burn down chart, like I'm getting the sense as the Scrum Master or the Agile coach, there's something of interest here. So you just bring that and you put it on your team wall, or you share it on your Zoom software, whatever you're using. And you ask folks, you say, hey, what's surprising to you about what you're seeing right now? That's generating insights. Within 5, 6 minutes, you're already in generating insights, right? So even if you have 20, 30 minutes only for your retro, you very quickly moved into something of generating deeper insights for your team. And then you can decide what to do by just coalescing around the action or the experiment or one of the 5 outcomes we talked about before. Before you close the retro, again with Roti as an example, just how did this go? You don't need, as Esther said, I'm just building on her point about that concrete example, you don't need lengthy activities for each one of the phases. They're there to support you when you find them useful.
Yeah, I I think you said it. Both of you said it all. Yeah.
So here's a question from Gerhard Ackerman, who Diana and I have known for many, many years.
Oh, Gerhard.
Example methods, please, for coming up with ideas of how to change our views and reactions to things we cannot change.
Well, one thing I can think of is, and this is a story I think I first heard from you, Esther, and then I found out it's a pattern because I have experienced it with teams I've worked with as well, where they have their big issue is interruptions and being asked to do things outside of what the team has agreed to do during their sprint or their iteration, and very often that's frustrating because those interruptions may come from somebody with significant power in the organization, or that has a particular relationship with one of the engineers or something, and they just come in and they frequently come in and interrupt what the team member is doing and say, could you just do this one thing for me, right? Could you just do this, right? And they've developed a habit of doing that. And what I do is what, Esther told me about doing with her team. It's like, well, that worked for them. I'm going to try it here. And it generally has worked. Is we say, okay, where is the appropriate? Okay, so we've identified that as a problem for us. Where is the appropriate place for those requests to come to? Well, they should come in through the product owner. So that enables the engineer to say, oh, I'd love to help you. I just need you to go talk to the product owner so that we make sure that it's getting the appropriate priority for our team. And then the product owner has to deal with it. But after a while, and sometimes it can take a long while, that higher up person who's coming in to continually interrupt and do that begins to get the message that they're not going to get immediate action. And they know that they'll get faster action if they go in through the appropriate channel to the team. And either that or they get promoted and move on, or something else may happen to them, but which also happens a lot in organizations, but things like that, where there's some outside force that the team really has no real control over, but they can have a conversation about how could we respond differently when this happens. And I think David's technique of let's take a few deep breaths. Yeah. Let's kind of let go of our adrenaline around this person and know that everybody's doing the best they can all the time, including them, right? And so how can we support them in making a different choice? And it has to do with how we respond to them. So,
and we have control over that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's
Okay.
one example. I mean, I think I could come up with some other ones, but it's that sort of thing. And when I saw that, when I've seen that one, I often think about Circles and Soup, which people tell me is one of the most popular activities for retrospectives of all time. Just being able to locate, where is this issue coming from?
Yeah.
And where, and enlarging the team's ideas about what they do have control over, but then acknowledging what they really don't. And then the various actions that they can take depending on where that issue lands.
Yeah, can I add one thing, Esther, before we move on to that, which is
Sure.
just clarification. The question was to offer some examples around how to change our views and our reactions. And
Yeah.
to me, those are two different things. And we're talking more about changing the reaction as opposed to changing the view. So, just to give a tangible example, let's say what we're suffering from, or we believe we're suffering from, is we're angry that there isn't enough budget to hire that designer that we really need to get the job done. And that's the situation. We're really frustrated. So you can imagine this. I was taught this by a coach of mine at one point, a pen. And you just kind of hold that pen as tightly as you can and imagine that the pen is the view that you have. So it's, that it is wrong that we don't have enough budget. And you just squeeze that pen as hard as you can. And then you ask yourself, how can I loosen that grip just slightly? Right? And it's not about changing my view. It's not about I don't hold the pen anymore and I'm going to take this other person's view. That's not the goal. The goal is still you have your view, and that's great. In fact, we need productive conflict and different points of view to be a productive team. That's good. But how can you lessen that grip that with a capital T truth that this is the right thing for my team, my view is right, just a bit. And just letting in that space between your hand and the pen and really physically doing it as a team can help prompt some curiosity. I think maybe actually the opposite is true, that the budget constraints are the best thing for my team. How could I just create some space for that? What might that enable for me? So there's another example.
Yeah, I sometimes try to imagine, in what world would this make sense?
Yeah.
Just so to take myself out of my own context and try to put myself in someone else's context. Like, how might this look from someone else's point of view?
Yeah. And I will often lean on the retrospective prime directive for that. If we believe for the moment, maybe not for all time, but for the moment, that this person is doing the best they can, but it's not a good fit for the situation, well, then what are the givens? Is it their skills and abilities? Is it the information they have? It's usually some systemic thing that is causing this to happen. And using that retrospective prime directive frame, sometimes we can begin to be able to sit in that other person's point of view for a moment and figure out what might be going on there, or lead us to some questions we might want to ask them, or some ways of dealing with them. All of those, I have seen all of those things happen through leaning on the retrospective prime directive.
Yeah. So I want to move on to another question. I think we can answer this one quickly, and then there's a few more I want to get to. How do you position retrospectives with companies and teams that aren't using Scrum? I've received quite a lot of pushback that retrospectives are only applicable if you're following the Scrum framework. That's a question from Neil Peterson. Retrospectives are mentioned, and reflection is mentioned in the Agile Manifesto. So it's not just for Scrum, and it's not just for Agile, and it's not just for software. Right.
Yes.
I mean, they can be useful anywhere. So you might point people to the manifesto if they're doing some flavor of Agile.
The 12th principle.
Yeah.
Right there.
A principle. Yeah. It's probably on David's back.
Yeah, I have one like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My favorite shirt.
Yeah. So, but go ahead.
No, I mean, even outside Agile, just to build on what you said, Esther, when uncertainty is high about the right course of action, the best thing you can do is learn a little bit more. And that's what retrospectives do. And uncertainty is high, regardless, in most creative industries, regardless of whether we're in Agile or Scrum or anything. It doesn't matter. If you don't know exactly how to get from point A to point B, the retrospective helps you navigate. That to me is the easiest way to explain it to someone who doesn't have exposure to that type of concept.
And I'm going to put in a little plug for this book that's sitting right next to me in my thumbnail. In that book, Trisha and I talk about how leaders can use retrospectives with their peers, with, in many kinds of situations that aren't necessarily tied to Agile at all, but certainly other frames of other kinds of other Agile methodologies. Okay.
Yes, 6 minutes,
Esther.
and there's
right.
2 questions that I really want us to get to.
Great.
So thoughts about sharing the retrospective results outside of the team. And there's quite a bit more that goes into that, but maybe we can just answer that question. What are your thoughts about sharing results outside of the team?
My point of view is that the results are the team's, and it's up to the team whether or not they'd like to share their results. And sometimes they may want to share results and sometimes not. But it's their results, and so they get to choose. If everybody is in agreement that that results sharing makes sense, one of the things that I found really expected, and Esther and I both experienced this, was an organization who trained a lot of a number of Scrum Masters in how to facilitate retrospectives, and then decided that instead of facilitating their own team's retrospectives, they would facilitate each other's. And that the bonus of that, it turned out to be that they started learning that things they thought were just issues for one team actually affected a lot of teams, and they could then go advocate for removing that impediment or changing that policy.
In theory, if you're doing Scrum, you should have something called a Scrum of Scrums, or at least there used to be something called a Scrum of Scrums, where Scrum Masters might get together and discuss those patterns. Because I do think it is useful to see patterns. What I don't like to see is retro results being reported up to the manager, so the manager can track and evaluate, well, is this team acting on their results, and or do they get an A or a B, or that's what I don't to see. So since we just have very few minutes left, I'm going to move on to this other question, which is about involving dev managers in retros.
Yeah, I mean, this is similar, I think, to the other question. Is if the dev manager is on the team in all aspects of the team, then that person is included in the retro by default. Otherwise, it's a voluntary opt-in, invite-only paradigm, right? If the team opts in to invite the dev manager because the team thinks that's the right move, that is very different than if the dev manager says, I want to come to your in fact, I am coming to your next retrospective because I want to help. Right, that they're very different modes there, and I'd be very careful on the latter one and very accepting and encouraging of the first one.
Yeah, and the reason has to do with status, right? And I mean, most of us work in systems that have hierarchies, and I mean, hierarchies are morally neutral, but there is a power difference between a manager and team members, and it's going to shape the patterns of interaction that happen. So you want to think really carefully about it.
There's a little quote in the book, I'll just put it in the chat here, I think you all can see it, which is default to privacy, opt in to transparency, which I think applies both to this situation we're talking about and the last question also. In other words, just as a rule for retrospectives, the conversation should be private, but the team can opt in to sharing whatever it chooses to opt into.
Okay, one final question. And, I apologize if I didn't get to your question. Maybe when we do the, let you know about where we end up putting the recording, we'll answer some of these questions. So is there as much Dharma in the book as there has been in this Zoom? I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question.
I mean, I'll come back with a Zen kind of response. What is Dharma? I mean, It's life, and I hope there is life in this book, and wisdom, and the wisdom that we've collected and that we are sharing, which isn't all wisdom, and some of you have more, and that's partly why we asked for stories from people outside of just our little group, but of other folks who have run retrospectives and have experiences they were willing to share. So, and I'm gonna go with the little winky smiley face there and think that that was a tongue-in-cheek question.
Okay, so we are we have a minute left. So any final words?
Thank you for joining us. And please
Yeah.
do remember that if you have a book club or if you just have individual questions, you can always get in touch with us. We're pretty easy to find individually and collectively.
Yeah.
So, you know, please feel free. I had somebody tell me that it was intimidating for somebody to come up and ask a question at a conference recently. And I'm like, please, please set that worry aside and just get in touch.
I love it when people ask me questions about
Yeah.
this kind of stuff.